On a rainy autumn afternoon, Emily Thompson watched the water droplets slide down the window of her small flower shop in Maple Valley, in the countryside of Chicago. The foot traffic was slow, as it had been for the past few months, and the worries weighed on her shoulders as heavily as the dark clouds in the sky. The bills piled up on the counter, and the deadline for the loan she had taken out to keep the business running was approaching. "It's going to be okay," she murmured to herself, adjusting an orchid arrangement in the window. The flower shop wasn't just her livelihood, it was a piece of her soul. Every flower, every vase, every customer who left with a smile on their face represented the fulfillment of a dream that began with her grandmother over 4 decades ago. Across the city of Chicago, in an isolated mansion in Pinecrest Heights, Alexander Montgomery watched the same rain through a floor-to-ceiling window in his office. At 45, his fortune was estimated in the billions, but his heart was as empty as the countless rooms in his residence. The walls adorned with priceless works of art were silent witnesses to his loneliness. "Mr. Montgomery," his secretary's voice came through the intercom. "The board is awaiting your decision on the expansion project." Alexander sighed, adjusting his custom-made Italian tie. "Tell them I'll need more time," he replied curtly. The corporate decisions that once excited him now felt meaningless. Ever since he discovered the true nature of his ex-fiancée 3 years ago, something inside him had closed off to the world. Back at the flower shop, Emily tried to make an important call. She needed to negotiate with her orchid supplier, but her trembling fingers dialed the wrong number. After 3 rings, a deep, velvety voice answered on the other end of the line. "Hello?" replied Alexander, intrigued by receiving a call on his private line. "Good afternoon. Am I speaking with the orchid man?" asked Emily, with her spontaneous and cheerful manner despite her worries. There was a pause on the other end. Alexander, accustomed to formal conversations filled with ulterior motives, was caught off guard by the simplicity of that voice. "No, you've dialed the wrong number," he replied, but something stopped him from hanging up immediately. "Oh, I'm so sorry." Emily laughed, a crystalline sound that echoed through the empty halls of Alexander's mansion. "It's just that I'm having such a hectic day that I can't even dial the right number. You know how it is. When it feels like everything is going wrong, even the phone numbers seem to conspire against you." Alexander found himself smiling, something he hadn't done in a long time. "I know exactly how that feels," he replied, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. "Well, I won't take up any more of your time," Emily continued. "I need to find the right number before my orchids decide to go on a blooming strike." "Wait," Alexander found himself saying before he could stop. "Why orchids?" The question sparked a conversation that would stretch on for hours. Emily, unaware she was speaking to one of the wealthiest men in the country, shared her stories about the flower shop, her dreams, and her daily struggles. Alexander, in turn, found himself captivated by the authenticity of this woman who, despite facing hardships, held onto hope and humor. When they finally hung up, it was already night. Alexander remained in his office, gazing at the illuminated city through the window. For the first time in years, he felt something different, a spark of life he had long lost. In his mind, an idea began to form, one that would change his life and Emily's forever. At the flower shop, Emily finally got the correct number for the supplier, but her mind kept drifting back to that unexpected conversation. There was something in that stranger's voice, a mix of melancholy and kindness that intrigued her. Little did she know, that twist of fate was about to turn her life upside down. In the days following the accidental call, Alexander couldn't get Emily's voice out of his thoughts. The calls became frequent, always initiated by him, as he had memorized the flower shop's number. For Emily, those conversations were a ray of sunshine amidst the dark clouds of her financial worries. "You know," she said during one of their nightly talks, "sometimes I think flowers are more honest than people. They don't pretend to be something they're not. They just bloom when they feel safe to do so." Those words struck Alexander deeply. In his world of business and appearances, sincerity was a rare currency. Sitting in his Italian leather armchair, he contemplated the immaculate gardens of his mansion, maintained by a team of gardeners, but lacking the soul that Emily described in her small flower shop. "What if I made a proposal?" he asked one night, after 2 weeks of daily conversations. A proposal that might seem crazy. Emily, who was arranging the last orchids of the day, felt her heart race. What kind of proposal? "Marry me," he said, the words slipping out before he could hold them back. "Without us meeting in person, no photos, no prior meetings, just based on what we already know about each other through these conversations." The bell on the flower shop door jingled in, the wind as if it too was surprised by the proposal. Emily sat on her usual stool, her hands trembling slightly. "You're joking, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been more serious in my life," Alexander replied. "I'm tired of relationships based on interests and appearances. Our conversations have more truth than all my years of social life." Emily looked at the bills stacked on the counter, at the walls that needed a fresh coat of paint, at the outdated computer that barely worked. She thought of her employees, who were more than co-workers, they were family. She thought of the community that relied on her flower shop for events and celebrations. "But you don't really know me," she argued, trying to make sense of the surreal situation. "I know what matters," he countered. "I know your heart, your way of seeing the world. The rest we can discover together." Alexander then explained his proposal in detail. The wedding would take place in a month, with all the necessary legal guarantees. He would provide her with a comfortable life, and in return, he asked only for her honesty and companionship. "There's one more thing," he added. "The wedding will be broadcast live. My company is launching a new streaming platform, and this unique story would be perfect for its debut." Emily felt the weight of that revelation. Not only was it a blind marriage, but it would also be a public event. Her hands found a solitary rose on the counter, her fingers caressing the soft petals, while her mind spun in turmoil. "Can I think about it for a moment?" she asked, her voice betraying the confusion of emotions that overwhelmed her. "Of course," he replied gently. "But know that, regardless of your answer, these conversations have already changed my life." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Lying in her simple bed in the small apartment above the flower shop, she weighed the pros and cons of that insane decision. The money from the marriage could save her business, help her employees, and keep her grandmother's legacy alive. But would it be fair to marry for those reasons? Then she remembered the conversations, the shared laughter, the confidences exchanged in the early hours of the morning. There was something real there, something she had never experienced in her previous relationships. Perhaps she thought fate had its own plans when it made her dial the wrong number that rainy afternoon. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window and illuminated her favorite orchids, Emily made her decision. She picked up the phone and, with her heart pounding, dialed the number she already knew by heart. "Yes," she said as soon as she heard the familiar voice on the other end. "I accept your proposal to marry you." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of Alexander's breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with emotion. "You've just made me the happiest man in the world." What Emily didn't know was that at that very moment, much larger gears were beginning to turn, and her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The weeks leading up to the wedding turned Emily's quiet life into a whirlwind. A production team invaded her flower shop, transforming the small establishment into a set for multiple scenes that would be used in the broadcast. Among the flowers and arrangements, cameras and technicians moved around, documenting every aspect of her routine. "But do you really need to show all of this?" Emily asked Sophia, the producer in charge of the event, as she adjusted a lily arrangement. "The audience loves real stories, Emily," replied Sophia, checking her notes. "And yours is extraordinary. A florist who falls in love with the voice of a mysterious man. It's like a modern-day fairy tale." Emily sighed, thinking about how her life had turned into a spectacle. Her conversations with Alexander continued, now even more intense and profound, but always at night, away from the cameras. It was her moment of privacy, her little refuge. In his mansion, Alexander was also dealing with his own dilemmas. His lawyer and longtime friend Michael questioned his decision. "Have you lost your mind, Alexander?" asked Michael, pacing back and forth in the office. "Marry a complete stranger, and on top of that turn it into a media spectacle?" "She's not a stranger," replied Alexander, his voice firm. "I know more about her than anyone who's ever been in my life." "What if she's like Victoria?" questioned Michael, referring to the ex-fiancée who had betrayed Alexander. "What if she's only interested in your money?" Alexander stopped signing the documents he was reviewing and stared at his friend. "Emily is different. She doesn't even know who I really am." Meanwhile, at the flower shop, Emily received an unexpected visit. Her brother Daniel appeared for the first time in months, his face marked by feigned concern. "Little sis," he exclaimed, eyeing the cameras with interest. "Why didn't you tell me about all this circus?" Emily felt her stomach churn. Daniel always showed up when he smelled money. "What do you want, Daniel?" "Can't I visit my only sister?" he replied, pretending to be offended. "Especially now that you're marrying a wealthy man." Emily froze. "How do you know that?" "Walls have ears, little sister," he smiled mischievously. "And I have my connections. Your mysterious fiancé isn't so mysterious to those who know where to look." That night, after closing the flower shop, Emily cried in her small apartment. Not just because of her brother's reappearance, but because she had used part of the wedding advance to pay off the most urgent debts of the flower shop. It was a secret that ate at her, but one she justified by the need to keep her business and her employees afloat. The phone rang, and Alexander's voice brought a bit of peace to her troubled heart. "Is everything okay?" he asked, sensing something different in her voice. "Yes," she lied, wiping away her tears. "Just tired with all these preparations." "Only 1 week left," he said, his voice soft, "and then we'll start our story together." What Emily didn't know was that, at that very moment, a figure from Alexander's past was also making moves. Victoria, his ex-fiancée, was watching one of the reports about the unexpected wedding from her luxurious penthouse. "So, he found a replacement," she murmured to herself, her eyes gleaming with a mix of anger and determination. "Let's see how long this florist lasts in his world." Victoria picked up her phone and made a call. "I need you to find out everything about a certain..." The day dawned with a gentle spring sun, and the Montgomery mansion was unrecognizable. Flowers of every color and species adorned every corner of the vast garden, turning the place into a true paradise. Emily still didn't know, but all the flowers had been purchased from small producers in Maple Valley, a specific order from Alexander to support the local economy. In the room specially prepared for the bride, Emily observed her reflection in the mirror as the production team moved around her. The dress, an exclusive design in ivory tones with French lace details, contrasted with her usual simplicity. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the bouquet of rare orchids, the same ones she had tried to order on the day of the phone call that changed her life. "5 minutes until we go live," announced Sophia, the producer, checking the final details. The cameras were already in place, broadcasting every moment to millions of viewers across the country. On the other side of the mansion, Alexander adjusted his tie for the 10th time. His heart raced, a mix of anxiety and anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Michael, his lawyer and best man, watched him with concern. "There's still time to cancel everything," Michael whispered, checking his gold watch. Alexander smiled calmly. "For the first time in my life, Michael, I'm absolutely certain of what I'm doing." The garden was filled with guests, a curious mix of important executives and the simple employees from Emily's flower shop. Among them, Victoria observed, everything with a calculated smile, her presence a silent shadow over the celebration. The music began to play, a soft melody echoing through the gardens. Emily took a deep breath, clutching her bouquet tightly. It was the moment. The doors opened, and she took her first steps toward the altar, where she would finally meet the man with whom she had shared so many deep conversations. The chatter of the guests ceased as Emily appeared. Her natural beauty and the nervous smile on her lips captivated everyone instantly. Alexander, with his back to the entrance as planned, felt his heart nearly leap out of his chest. When Emily reached the altar, There was a moment of suspense that made millions of viewers hold their breath. Alexander turned slowly, and their eyes met for the first time. The shock was visible on Emily's face. Standing before her was Alexander Montgomery, the reclusive billionaire whose face she had seen in business magazines. Her legs weakened slightly, but she stood firm, her eyes locked on his. Alexander, in turn, felt hypnotized. The woman before him was more beautiful than any image his mind had conjured, but it wasn't her beauty that captivated him. It was the strength and sincerity he saw in her eyes, the same qualities that had won him over through the phone. "Good afternoon, Emily," he said, his deep, familiar voice sending a shiver down her spine. "Finally, I can see the face of the woman who changed my life with a wrong number." Emily couldn't suppress a small smile despite her surprise. "You could have told me who you were," she whispered, "and missed the chance to be loved for who I am, not for what I have," he replied, his eyes gleaming with emotion. The ceremony unfolded like a dream. The officiant's words, the vows of love, the exchange of rings, everything felt surreal to Emily. Millions of people watched this unique moment, a wedding that defied all social conventions. Among the guests, Victoria clutched her champagne, glass tightly, her smile growing more strained. Daniel, Emily's brother, observed everything with a calculating gleam in his eyes, his mind already scheming ways to take advantage of the situation. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Alexander gently cupped Emily's face in his hands. "Ready for our adventure?" he asked, moments before sealing his lips in a passionate kiss that made the audience erupt in applause. In that magical moment, neither Emily nor Alexander could have imagined the challenges that awaited them. The fairy tale was just beginning, and reality would soon show that not every love is born perfect. Sometimes it needs to be built, brick by brick, overcoming obstacles and revealing hidden truths. The honeymoon was replaced by a gradual adaptation to their new life. Emily found herself immersed in a world completely different from her own, where every detail exuded luxury and sophistication. The Montgomery mansion, with its endless hallways and priceless works of art, felt more like a museum than a home. "Your breakfast, Mrs. Montgomery," announced Eleanor, the housekeeper, bringing an elaborate tray of imported goods and exotic fruits. Emily looked at the lavish meal and sighed. "You know, Eleanor, I'd love some toast with drip coffee." The housekeeper hesitated, her hands tense over her impeccable apron. "But Mr. Montgomery always insists on the best, and sometimes the best is found in simplicity," Emily replied with a gentle smile, getting up to make her own coffee in the kitchen, much to the staff's astonishment. Alexander watched these small acts of rebellion with a mix of fascination and discomfort. Accustomed to people who were dazzled by his wealth, Emily's simplicity and authenticity unsettled him. One morning he found her in the garden barefoot, chatting with the gardener about growing roses. "You don't have to do this," he said, concerned about her image. "We have a team to take care of the garden." Emily turned to him, a radiant smile on her face and dirt on her hands. "It's not about needing to, Alexander. It's about loving what you do. You should try getting your hands dirty in the soil someday." Those words echoed in Alexander's mind during his board meeting that afternoon. As they discussed numbers and strategies, he found himself thinking about Emily's genuine joy when talking about flowers. At home, Emily was also facing her own challenges. The constant media pressure meant every step she took was analyzed and commented on. Gossip magazines speculated about her past, her intentions, her ability to fit into the world of the wealthy. "Don't let it get to you," advised Sophia, who had become a close friend after the wedding. "They're always looking for stories to sell." But what bothered Emily the most was Alexander's emotional distance. Despite sharing the same house, sometimes she felt they were closer when they only spoke on the phone. He spent long hours at the office, immersed in work, maintaining the same solitary routine as before. One night, after a particularly silent dinner, Emily decided to take action. She prepared 2 cups of chamomile tea, just like she used to in her old home, and went to Alexander's office. "May I come in?" she asked, swaying the simple ceramic tray. Alexander looked up from the documents he was reviewing, surprised by the interruption. "Of course," he replied, watching curiously as she placed a cup in front of him. "You know," Emily began, sitting in the armchair across from his desk, "when we used to talk on the phone, you would tell me about your dreams, your fears, your hopes. Now that we're married, it feels like we've built a wall between us." The sincerity of her words struck Alexander like a bolt of lightning. It was true. Since the wedding, he had closed himself off again, instinctively protecting himself as he always did. "It's not easy," he admitted finally. "I've spent so much time protecting myself that sometimes I don't know how to let someone get close." Emily stood up and walked over to him, gently touching his face. "Then let's relearn together. How about we start with a walk in the garden? No phones, no work, just the two of us?" That night, under the starry sky, Alexander and Emily walked hand in hand through the gardens of the mansion. He told her about his lonely childhood, about how money always seemed to create a barrier between him and the world. She spoke about her grandmother, about how she learned that flowers have the power to heal broken hearts. What they didn't know was that while they were building their first real bridges, external forces were already at work to tear them down. Victoria had begun spreading rumors in social circles, insinuating that Emily was an opportunist who had planned everything from the start, and Daniel, Emily's brother, was preparing his next move, armed with information that could shake the foundations of their still fragile marriage. The growing closeness between Emily and Alexander was beginning to bear its first fruits when the past decided to knock on the doors of the Montgomery mansion. On a seemingly ordinary morning, Victoria appeared during breakfast, her presence instantly silencing the dining room. "Alexander, darling," she exclaimed, as if she still had the right to the intimacy of days gone by. "We need to talk about the resort project in Miami." Emily observed the elegant woman who had just invaded her space. Victoria was everything she was not. Sophisticated, impeccably dressed in a designer ensemble with jewelry that surely cost more than a year's revenue from her old flower shop. Alexander visibly stiffened. "Victoria, any professional matters should be handled at the office with an appointment." "Oh, but it's urgent," Victoria insisted, casting a condescending glance at Emily. "Matters that your new wife might not understand." Emily stood up calmly, surprising them both. "Actually, I'd love to understand. After all, I am now part of Alexander's life, and that includes his business." Victoria smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Darling, don't take this the wrong way, but some things require a certain experience in the corporate world." "Like betraying someone's trust?" asked Emily, her voice soft but firm. "Because I understand that well. I can recognize when someone has ulterior motives." Victoria's face paled slightly, while Alexander looked at his wife with a mix of surprise and admiration. Emily continued, "Alexander told me about you, about how you used insider information for your own benefit. So if there's something urgent to discuss, we can do it together right now." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Emily's phone. It was a message from her brother Daniel. "I need $500,000 today, or your husband will find out what you did with the wedding money." Emily felt her stomach churn, but she maintained her composure. Victoria, noticing her sudden pallor, smiled again. "Perhaps you have your own secrets to hide, don't you?" she teased before elegantly walking away. That afternoon, while Alexander was in a meeting, Emily received a visit from Daniel at her flower shop, which she still kept running. "How could you do this to me?" she questioned, confronting her brother. "You disappeared for months, and now you come back just to blackmail me." Daniel shrugged, playing with a flower arrangement. "You have a billionaire husband now. What's $500,000 to him? It's the least I deserve as your brother." "I won't give you a single penny," Emily replied firmly. "If you want to tell Alexander about the money I used to save the flower shop, go ahead. I'd rather face the consequences than keep being manipulated by you." What neither of them knew was that Sophia, the producer who had become friends with Emily, had witnessed the entire conversation. Without them noticing, she recorded everything on her phone. That evening, Alexander noticed something different about Emily. "Did something happen?" he asked, concerned about her silence during dinner. Emily took a deep breath, gathering courage. She had decided she would no longer live with that weight on her conscience. But before she could speak, Daniel burst. into the dining room, visibly upset. "Your wife is a fraud," he shouted, throwing documents on the table that proved the wedding money had been used for the flower shop. Alexander's face transformed as he read the papers. Years of distrust and trauma resurfaced in seconds. Emily saw the wall she had fought, so hard to tear down, rise again between them, taller and thicker than before. The silence that followed Daniel's revelation was deafening. Alexander held the documents so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Emily remained motionless, her heart beating so loudly she could hear it echoing in her ears. "So that's it?" Alexander's voice came out low, controlled, but filled with disappointment. "All this time, you were only interested in the money." "It's not that simple," Emily tried to explain, her hands trembling on the dining table. "The flower shop was on the verge of bankruptcy. People depended on me." "And you didn't think to tell me," he interrupted her, his voice gradually rising. "After all our conversations about trust and honesty?" Daniel watched the scene with a satisfied smile, while Victoria, who had coincidentally stayed for a drink after the morning argument, savored every moment of the destruction she had helped orchestrate. "Alexander," Emily stood up, trying to reach him, "I was going to tell you today, but you need to understand that place isn't just a business to me. It's entire families that depend on it. It's my grandmother's legacy. It's—" "Enough," Alexander slammed the table, making the silverware clatter. "I thought you were different, that I had finally found someone who loved me for who I am, not for what I have. But you're just like everyone else." Tears now streamed freely down Emily's face. "How can you say that, after everything we've shared? Do you think our conversations, our confidences were lies?" "And weren't they?" he retorted bitterly. "You planned all of this from the beginning, didn't you? The wrong call, the endless conversations, all part of a plan to get close to the lonely billionaire." Emily felt as if she had been slapped. "You can't believe that. Alexander, look at me. You know me." "I thought I did," he replied coldly. "Michael was right. I was a fool to believe I could find something real." At that moment, Sophia, who had arrived quietly, decided to intervene. "Mr. Montgomery, I think you should see this." She held out her phone, showing the recording of the conversation between Emily and Daniel earlier. But Alexander was blinded by pain and distrust. "I don't need to see anything else. I've seen enough." "So that's how it is?" Emily asked, her voice regaining its strength. "You talk so much about trust, about being truthful, but at the first sign of difficulty, the first doubt, you just give up. It's not me who's betraying our trust now, Alexander. It's you." She walked toward the door, pausing only for a moment. "Do you know what the difference is between us? Yes, I made a mistake. I used the money to save not just a business, but an entire community. And I was willing to tell you everything, to face the consequences. You're just repeating old patterns, hiding behind your walls of distrust." Victoria seized the moment to add salt to the wound. "Alexander, darling, you've always known that people like us can only trust our own kind." Emily cast one last look at her husband, a look that mixed disappointment and determination. "You turned our marriage into a marketing spectacle, exposed our story to millions of people, but now you refuse to hear the truth when it's right in front of your eyes." With those words, she left the room, leaving behind a Ricardo torn between anger and growing doubt, a Daniel frustrated that his plan hadn't resulted in money, and a Victoria secretly pleased with the chaos she had helped create. That night, as the rain battered Chicago, Emily returned to her old home above the flower shop. Among her plants and flowers, she cried not only for the love that seemed lost, but also for the disappointment of realizing that sometimes even the deepest feelings can't overcome the scars of the past. The morning after the storm, Sophia arrived, early at the Montgomery mansion, determined to reveal the whole truth. She found Alexander in his office, his red eyes betraying a sleepless night. "Mr. Montgomery, there's something you need to know," she said, connecting her phone to the office sound system. The recording began to play, revealing not only the conversation between Emily and Daniel, but also an earlier conversation between Victoria and Emily's brother, planning the entire situation. She planned to use the wedding money to help the community, explained Sophia, showing documents on her tablet. Her flower shop isn't just a business, it's a community center. She offers free gardening classes for underprivileged youth, employs women in vulnerable situations, and a significant portion of the profits goes to social projects in the neighborhood. Alexander sank into his chair, the weight of his mistake, pressing down on him. Why did she never tell me this? Because she wanted you to know her for who she is, not for what she does, replied Sophia. And also because she was afraid you wouldn't understand her decision to use the wedding money that way. Meanwhile, at the flower shop, Emily was arranging her orchids when she received an unexpected visit. Margaret, a 70-year-old woman who attended the gardening workshops, walked in carrying a small pot of violets. "I saw the news, my dear," said the lady, placing the vase on the counter, "and I came to tell you that we are all here for you. This flower shop saved my life after I lost my husband. It gave me a purpose, a family." Gradually, more people began to arrive. Students from the workshops, employees who found a new chance at life, mothers who left their children in the educational space while they worked. Each brought a flower, a story, a thank you. "Look at this," said a reporter passing by, drawn to the commotion. The real story behind the flower shop is here. The story aired that same afternoon. Alexander, who had begun to investigate Emily's work more deeply, watched the report in his office. The images showed much more than just a flower shop. They revealed a social transformation project that had changed hundreds of lives. Victoria, who was following the news from her penthouse, realized that her plan had backfired. The story of the flower shop and Emily's social work was going viral on social media, generating a wave of support and admiration. Daniel, pressured by the public exposure and the possibility of being sued for blackmail, decided to tell the whole truth. In-house, a recorded confession, he revealed how Victoria had approached him, offering money to create the entire situation. Alexander, devastated by how he had treated Emily, tried calling her several times, but she didn't answer his calls. Then, he had an idea. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of the flower shop, just as he had done months ago. "Maple. Valley Florist, good afternoon," answered Emily, her professional voice hiding her emotions. "Hi," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I dialed the wrong number. I was trying to call someone I hurt deeply, someone I judged without knowing the whole story, someone who let the fear of the past destroy something precious." Emily held the phone tightly, silent tears streaming down her face. "And what would you say to that person if you could talk to them?" "I would say that I'm a proud idiot who almost lost the best thing that ever happened to me. I would say that I've learned love isn't just about trust, but about trying to understand, about giving the truth a chance, and most of all, I would say that I'm desperately sorry." The silence that followed felt eternal. Finally, Emily replied, "You know, sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloom after the storm. But they need care, patience, time to heal." Autumn painted the streets of Chicago with golden hues as Alexander began his journey of reconciliation. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that. Trust, once broken, was like a rare porcelain. It could be repaired, but the marks would remain as a reminder of the fragility of relationships. Her first action was to turn Emily's flower shop into an official project of the Montgomery Foundation. Not as a way to buy her forgiveness, but as recognition of the social impact she had created. "I don't want your money, Alexander," Emily said when he presented the proposal on a rainy afternoon. "I want you to understand why I did what I did." He looked around the small shop, observing the smiling faces of the women who worked there, the children doing homework in a corner specially prepared for them, the elderly participating in an Ikebana workshop. "Will you teach me?" he asked, surprising Emily. "Teach me to see the world through your eyes." And so began a slow process of rediscovery. Alexander began dedicating a few hours of his afternoons to learning every aspect of Emily's work. He learned the names of each employee, listened to their stories of overcoming adversity, and understood how a simple flower arrangement could mean so much more than decoration. Victoria, realizing her plans had completely failed, made one last attempt. this time directing her revenge at the finances of the Montgomery Company. But Alexander, strengthened by his new perspective on life, not only thwarted her attempt, but also publicly exposed her past manipulations. "You've changed," observed Michael, his lawyer and friend, during a meeting. "You're more human." Alexander smiled, looking out the window of his office toward the city. "Emily taught me that succession isn't just measured by numbers on a spreadsheet." At the flower shop, Emily was also going through her own transformation. The pain of mistrust was still there, but it was gradually giving way to a deeper understanding of the man she had married. Through the stories shared by the company's longtime employees, she began to better understand the fears and traumas that had shaped Alexander. One afternoon, while working together in the community garden they had created behind the flower shop, Alexander cut himself on a rose thorn. Emily instinctively took his hand to clean the wound. "Sometimes we need to feel the pain to appreciate the beauty," she said, her gentle fingers tending to the small cut. Alexander held her hand, preventing her from pulling away. "Forgive me," he whispered, his eyes meeting hers. "Not just for what happened, but for all the times I let my fear speak louder than my heart." Emily felt her defenses begin to crumble. "Do you know why flowers are so special?" she asked, her voice soft. "Because even after the harshest winter, they find the strength to bloom again." In that moment, surrounded by the scent of roses and the sound of children's laughter playing in the garden, something began to shift. It wasn't a fresh start. It was something deeper, more mature. It was the understanding that true love is not just about perfect moments, but about the courage to face imperfections together. Sophia, who continued documenting the couple's story, noticed the change. The cameras, which once captured an artificial fairy tale, now recorded something far more valuable, a real story of learning and growth. "Perhaps," she reflected in one of her notes, "true love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone willing to grow and learn with you." Spring arrived in Chicago, bringing with it an explosion of colors and renewal. The Maple Valley Flower Shop, now transformed into a model community center, was unrecognizable, not because of luxury or ostentation, but because of the harmonious blend between the original charm of the place and the structural improvements that allowed it to serve even more people. On an especially sunny morning, Alexander and Emily walked hand in hand through the main garden, where several families were participating in a planting workshop. They were no longer the reclusive billionaire and the simple florist. They were just two people who had learned that love is a flower that needs to be nurtured daily. "Remember our first phone call?" Emily asked, stopping near a bed of orchids. "I was so desperate to save this place." Alexander hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "And I was so closed off in my world that I almost missed the chance to know yours." The project that began with the flower shop had expanded. Now there were similar hubs in different parts of the city, each adapted to local needs. The social work Emily had timidly started had grown into a larger movement of community transformation. "Mrs. Emily," called Mrs. Margaret, approaching with a group of children. "Look at what our little gardeners have managed to do." The children, proud, showed small pots with seedlings they had planted. Their eyes sparkled with the same passion that Emily had when talking about flowers. Alexander watched the scene with a smile on his lips. He remembered how just a few months ago he was trapped in his glass tower, surrounded by luxury but empty of meaning. Now his mornings began with the scent of flowers and the sound of laughter. "I have a surprise for you," he said to Emily, guiding her to a covered area of the garden. There they found Sophia and a small film crew. On the mounted screen, a documentary about the journey of Maple Valley floriculture and its impact on the community began to play. It was no longer a reality show about an unusual marriage, but a real story of social transformation. "This is just the beginning," explained Alexander. "We want to document similar stories across the country, inspiring others to make a difference in their communities." Emily felt tears in her eyes as she saw her students, employees, and friends sharing their stories on the screen. Each testimony was a testament to how small acts of love could create waves of change. "You know," she said, turning to Alexander, "when you proposed to me over the phone, I thought it was crazy. Now I understand that sometimes we need to take a leap of faith for the magic to happen. At that moment, as if the universe wanted to celebrate with them, a blue butterfly landed on Emily's shoulder. Alexander smiled, remembering one of the first lessons she had taught him about nature. The most beautiful transformations happen in silence. "How about we renew our vows?" he proposed, taking her hands. "Not for the cameras, not for the world, but for us. Here in this garden we built together." Emily looked around. The flowers they had planted together, the people whose lives they had touched, the stories they had shared, all of it bore witness to a journey that went far beyond a blind marriage. "I accept," she replied, her eyes shining. "But this time let's do it our way." And so, in a simple yet deeply meaningful ceremony, Alexander and Emily renewed their promises. There was no live broadcast, no distinguished guests, just the community they had helped build, the flowers they had cultivated together, and the love they had learned to nurture. In the end, it wasn't a story about a billionaire and a florist. It was a story about how true love has the power to break down walls, heal wounds, and transform not just two hearts but an entire community. It was a story about how sometimes fate's mistakes are just the beginning of something extraordinary. And as the sun set on the horizon of Chicago, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Alexander and Emily remained embraced in their garden, knowing they had found something far more valuable than any fortune. They had found each other, and together they had discovered the true meaning of making life flourish.